Artificial Intelligence, a fan's novel. Book 1, Chapter 2, Monica. The overgrown rainforest around them passed by without their notice. It was the result of climate changes that had happened long before they were born. They knew no other world. They were used to it. They'd been along this route dozens of times before, and Henry could maneuver the winding road without thinking, but the silence was new. She had not said a word since they'd left home over an hour ago. She played no music, none of the 20th century folk songs that she collected, or the Strauss waltzes that he'd always complained about when they'd just been dating. The only sound was the mechanical whir of their cruiser and the occasional call of some forest creature beyond the window. The silence disturbed him more than the reasons they were on this trip again. Beside him, his wife applied makeup. It was a routine of hers, a repetition of movements that seemed to be a device to keep her hands and mind preoccupied more than anything else. She was a beautiful woman, but her eyes had been growing distant in recent months. Initially, she'd been able to deal with the pain. She had never let hope slip from her grasp, and he'd let her optimism affect him. He'd let her refusal to accept the inevitable keep him, too, in this state of emotional limbo. But the fortress from which she defended her breaking heart had barricades insufficient to challenge the merciless assault of fate. Her once spontaneous chatter had disappeared, replaced by short and evasive responses to his attempts at conversation. A darkness had overcome her spirit. He was at a complete loss to deal with this shadow on her heart, and loss was the one thing he'd had enough of. Henry turned his attention to the passing landscape outside, wondering how many struggling souls made their encampments in the forest beyond the road. For the Swintons, life had been a series of jumps up the corporate ladder. They were never in want for food or shelter like so many in the shanties and the streets of broken cities that had been starved and washed away in the deluge ages ago. They'd never want for the simple conveniences of life that so many fought for every day. But he traded all in for one irreplaceable thing. The groan of an old pain welled in his chest, and he suppressed it. He turned his thoughts away from that. He had to be strong for her. He was all she had left, and he. They would get through this. She would learn to let go as he was learning, somehow. Their cruiser whirred through a young and changing landscape. As they passed, something cried out from the depths of the forest. It was a shrill sound that penetrated the humid gloom. Neither of them noticed. In the cool darkness of the cryogenics department, a respectful silence was dutifully imposed. Sharp noises were muted by tonal dampers in the corners of the room. This was a place where death was imminent, a patient specter, always waiting at the door to taunt those who visited their resting loved ones. Of those that slept here, only a handful would ever leave alive. And among those, the chances of ever returning to the life they had once known was minimal. They were the aged mothers and fathers of the wealthy, whose sleep was a last chance to beat death. Perhaps they would stay in this state until some cure for that human condition was magically chanced upon. But what were the chances of that? The Swintons were headed for another ward. In this room were the injured or disease-stricken sons and daughters of those who could not bear the loss. For it was not just the loss of a child, which was in itself enough, but it was the loss of the chance of having a child at all. The federal government had invoked and strictly enforced restrictive licenses on birth. It would be many years before lovers would bring another life into the world at their own whim, if ever. She was here now, walking briskly through the artificially silenced room. The whispers of visitors and doctors and the hum from the banks of life-preserving cryogenic tubes were inaudible to her. Henry followed quietly behind. From a silent space inside, his heart was calling out to her. She would not notice. As she arrived, their son's cryotube was being lowered from its parking space in the wall, where he slept in a frozen stasis, awaiting a miracle that would bring him back to her. It had been many years since she had cried entering this sterile room. It had all become routine, a routine that she desperately needed. It kept her from falling into that darkness that loomed at the edge of the world around her, the gloom that she caught desperate glimpses of when she was at home trying to go through the now meaningless motions of daily life. She sat down in the viewing well that surrounded her son's glass home. He was peaceful. He was sleeping. This she let herself see. The ice encrusting the inside of the glass was invisible to her. She did not see the occasional wisp of gas that floated inside over her sleeping boy's face and momentarily fogged his image. His blue and frozen flesh made no difference to her. She did not acknowledge Henry as he moved into the well and sat down beside her, nor the troubled look that he wore. She took from her satchel a small music player that Henry had bought for her. On it were hours of music samples of her choosing. This week she had chosen some of Martin's favorites. She'd brought the bouncing Strauss waltzes to which he used to fling himself around the house as a little boy. She placed a vibra speaker against the glass tube so her sleeping son would hear his mother's loving voice, and pulled from her satchel the book she had brought. It was a book he'd loved as a little child. An image came into her mind's eye, a memory of his childish wonderment as she'd read to him all those years ago arose and threatened to break her heart. But she forced that image away and began to read. Robin of Sherwood Forest, she read the cover and opened the book. The baby was born as the first leaves of autumn fell, a baby boy, and Marion's wish came true. The boy had white hair. He was baptized Martin after his grandfather. As she read, a man in a white lab coat entered the room behind them. His quick footfalls were softened by the dampers, but Henry had been awaiting his arrival and jumped up to greet the man. Dr. Fraser, hello. It's so good to see you, Henry said. The doctor returned Henry's desperate handshake. He could see the new creases along the man's forehead and feel the anticipation in his grip. It was always the unspoken question. Is there something new? Any sign of hope? Henry had become the most devoted of all the parents of the young patients in his ward. He had begun to scan the medical journals for himself, desperately seeking anything that even hinted at a solution to the puzzling illness that had taken his son away. That this thing had taken its toll on him was plain to see. Henry whispered urgently about something he'd found. Listen, there was an article by Randenbach in the Journals of Chinese Medicine about these virus locators, synthetic microscopic hunter-killers. Henry rambled on. The doctor let the man speak. He knew what article Henry was talking about and didn't have the heart to tell him what he thought about it. Let him cling to the idea of a possibility for now. There were more pressing concerns. Dr. Fraser knelt down beside the woman seated in the visiting well. Hello again, Monica, he said. She did not respond. She was lost in her routine. The doctor was greatly troubled by this. This was not the same woman that he had met when their young son was brought into cryogen. She was withdrawn, guarded, working on a level of rote behavior like an automaton. Behind him, Henry went on about Random Box's futile research. This was his form of denial. Fraser sighed. Perhaps it was time for them to deal with reality. He stood and started to reply to Henry. "I can still hear you," Monica cried suddenly. The men were silenced by the outburst, and she continued to read. Had it really been 5 years since she'd last heard her Martin's boyish laughter? 5 years since she'd last tucked her little boy under the covers after he'd fallen asleep while she read from this very book. 5 long, insufferable years since she'd fussed over, scolded, and held her beautiful boy in her arms as he laughed and wriggled, trying to escape before the tickling started. Her heart had so long been broken that the pain was a continual presence in her chest. It was part of her now. And what was it that had taken him away from her? What was this mysterious malady that had destroyed their world? Sinclair syndrome by name. A syndrome. This was a scientific term. It described symptoms, events announcing the onslaught of unnamed swarms of invisible marauders. But it really meant defeat. A syndrome was not an answer. It was an unanswerable question. This was not what had happened to her Martin. He had been stolen from her. From the first dizzy spells to the horrible convulsions, and finally that unforgettable morning when he would not awaken from his sweat-drenched slumber. Science had not been able to solve this riddle. Now they had a name for it, and somehow that was supposed to explain all. How long had it been before they'd known the name of this thief? A month? No, it had been less. It had been 28 days of unknowing, of awful uncertainty, as their only child spiraled down the edge of some undetected abyss, never to return. Her heart had gone there with him. She had been the champion of the fight during that first year. Like any parent, she had clung to the thin fabric of hope that came from the multitude of new treatments and designer elixirs introduced from the numerous corporate labs that built fortunes on selling dreams. She would not surrender to the claims of hopelessness by detached experts whose only stake in the game was their reputation. It was her gamble, and she had to gamble with her only son, the only child she would ever be allowed to have. She had to stick this one out, no matter what. And she had. Sinclair syndrome was not always fatal, but those who were diagnosed could be left in a state of coma until their bodies were simply useless. Even cryogenics had its limitations. The only thing that kept her going had been the possibility of misdiagnosis. They had been accepted for a stasis module, and Martin had been asleep there for 5 impossible years. But how long could she keep this up, this dream? She had been raised on older values. Her old friends had gone on to their corporate games of King of the Hill, and she had chosen to marry and be a mother, knowing from her own loving mother that this was a noble pursuit. But the one thing that she had lived for, had sacrificed her own ambitions for, had been mercilessly ripped from her grasp. She could not go on. She could not go back. Her heart had come to a place where it would have to stay. She could not imagine saying goodbye. She'd never allow that. She read. "I worry about her, Henry," Fraser said, as the 2 men made their way across the room. "Yes, I know. I... Henry stuttered, lost for a response. On the wall before them, fairy tale paintings tried to pretend that this was not a place of death. In one image, some men carried a naked emperor on a sedan. Who had chosen that painting? How devastatingly apropos. She really has me worried, Fraser continued. She's in this most difficult position of feeling that she should mourn the death of your son. And after 5 years, Henry, your instincts tell you to mourn him too. But all this medicine assures us that mourning is inappropriate, that Martin is merely pending. Pending. Henry repeated the word. Isn't that how their whole life had become? Pending, an image on pause, frozen like their son, in a time that should have ended years ago. And all her grief just goes undigested, Fraser said. He gazed at this loyal, loving man, and his heart sank. He'd seen lesser men give up before the fight had really begun. Why did the good seem to suffer more? Henry didn't want to acknowledge Fraser's gaze, didn't want to look the man in the eye. He knew what he'd see there. But he had to be strong for Monica. He forced himself to look at the man and saw an unspoken statement. Dr. Fraser saw this conflict in Henry's face. Henry, your son may be beyond our science, he admitted. But it's your wife who can still be reached. Henry turned to watch Monica read to their dying boy. Martin would not hear her from the depths of his cryogenic slumber, and in all likelihood, he'd probably never hear her voice again. Henry shuddered. He loved his son, loved him more than his heart could stand. But there were those awful moments, weren't there? He'd deny them if anyone ever asked. But there were those awful moments when he just wished it was all over. One way or another.